OpenAI just tried to divorce Nvidia after a $100 billion deal supposedly stalled, and the fallout sent Nvidia's stock plummeting 10% while both companies scrambled to do damage control. Reports claim Jensen Huang questioned OpenAI's business discipline, while OpenAI publicly trashed Nvidia's chips and signed a $10 billion deal with their biggest competitor. Sam Altman had to go on Twitter and basically beg people to believe they still love Nvidia. Let's break down what actually happened and why this relationship just got extremely complicated. Before we get into this mess, drop a comment and tell me, do you think OpenAI is justified in diversifying away from Nvidia, or are they biting the hand that literally built their entire empire? Alright, so the phrase Nvidia divorce has been trending everywhere, and it refers to this intense period of market speculation and reported friction between OpenAI and Nvidia that peaked in early February 2026. Despite all the sensationalist headlines about a divorce, both companies have gone into full damage control mode, publicly reaffirming their partnership while simultaneously making moves that hedge their bets against each other. It's basically a corporate marriage where both parties are already talking to divorce lawyers but insisting everything is fine. Let's start with what actually sparked all this drama. The whole thing was set off by two major reports that came out in late January and early February 2026. First, there was this supposed $100 billion deal that apparently stalled. Back in September 2025, Nvidia and OpenAI announced a massive letter of intent for a $100 billion infrastructure partnership. That's an insane amount of money. But then reports from the Wall Street Journal and Reuters recently suggested that negotiations had completely stalled out. Nobody was saying exactly why, but the fact that a deal that big wasn't moving forward was a huge red flag. Then we got reports about Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia, expressing private doubts about OpenAI's business discipline. That's corporate speak for, we don't think you know what you're doing with money. In a tense exchange with reporters in Taipei on January 31st, 2026, Huang had to clarify Nvidia's position. He said, no, nothing like that, when asked about the $100 billion investment. He specifically stated, we will consider each round at a time. That's a massive walk back from the original announcement. Going from, we're doing a $100 billion partnership to, we'll think about it one investment at a time, is basically corporate language for we're having serious second thoughts about this relationship. But it gets worse. Reports also emerged that OpenAI was unsatisfied with Nvidia's latest chips for inference. Now, this is a critical technical distinction that matters a lot. Training an AI model and running an AI model are two completely different processes with different hardware requirements. Training is when you're building the model, feeding it data, teaching it patterns. Inference is when the model is actually deployed and users are asking it questions and getting responses. OpenAI's costs are exploding on the inference side because millions of people are using ChatGPT every day. Every single query costs them money in compute power. So if Nvidia's chips aren't efficient enough for inference, that's a massive problem for OpenAI's business model. They need chips that can handle inference faster and cheaper, or their operating costs will bankrupt them no matter how much funding they raise. Now, calling what happened next trashing is probably an exaggeration of the internal friction, but OpenAI has taken some very concrete steps to reduce their total dependence on Nvidia. And these aren't small steps. These are major strategic moves that fundamentally change the relationship. First, OpenAI is co-designing its own AI chips with Broadcom and TSMC. Mass production is scheduled for 2026. This is huge because it allows them to completely bypass what people call the Nvidia tax. When you're dependent on one supplier for critical hardware, that supplier can basically charge whatever they want. By designing their own chips specifically optimized for their models, OpenAI can potentially cut costs dramatically and have hardware that's perfectly suited to their specific needs, rather than general purpose GPUs. But wait, it gets even more dramatic. OpenAI recently signed a $10 billion deal with Cerebras Systems, which is literally one of Nvidia's biggest competitors. Cerebras claims their hardware can handle inference significantly faster and cheaper than Nvidia's GPU clusters. That's a direct shot at Nvidia. You don't sign a $10 billion deal with your main supplier's competitor unless you're serious about diversifying away from that supplier. And it's not just Cerebras. OpenAI's head of compute recently made a statement that was clearly designed to send a message. They said that while Nvidia is foundational to their infrastructure, they are deliberately expanding their ecosystem to include AMD and Cerebras. That phrasing is important. Foundational sounds nice, but it's past tense energy. It's like saying you are important to us rather than you are important to us. So you've got OpenAI publicly acknowledging Nvidia's role while simultaneously announcing they're working with every major Nvidia competitor they can find. That's not exactly a vote of confidence. The market definitely didn't interpret it as business as usual. Following all these reports, Nvidia's stock dropped 10%. For a company as massive as Nvidia, that's billions of dollars in market value just evaporated. And the headlines were brutal. Every tech publication was running some version of the Nvidia divorce, or OpenAI dumps Nvidia, or the $100 billion breakup. This was terrible PR for both companies. Nvidia looked like they were getting ditched by by their most important customer. OpenAI looked like they were biting the hand that fed them. Neither narrative was great for investor confidence, so Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, had to go on Twitter and do damage control. He posted, "We love working with Nvidia, and they make the best AI chips in the world. We hope to be a gigantic customer for a very long time. I don't get where all this insanity is coming from." Now, let's break down that statement because it's actually pretty revealing, even though it's trying to sound reassuring. We love working with Nvidia. That's standard corporate speak. Nobody ever says, "We hate working with our supplier," publicly, even if it's true. They make the best AI chips in the world. Notice he didn't say, "They make the best chips for what we need," or "They're our exclusive partner," just that they make good chips generally. We hope to be a gigantic customer for a very long time. Hope is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Also, customer, not partner. That's a significant word choice. And then, I don't get where all this insanity is coming from. That's interesting because the insanity is coming from OpenAI signing $10 billion deals with Nvidia's competitors and reports about stalled negotiations on the $100 billion partnership. Sam Altman absolutely knows where the insanity is coming from. He's hoping everyone will just forget about the actual business moves OpenAI is making. So what's the current status of this relationship? The best way to describe it is it's complicated. The relationship has fundamentally shifted from what was basically a symbiotic monopoly to what's now a strategic rivalry. Nvidia is no longer just a supplier. They're now an investor in OpenAI's rivals, like Anthropic. They're also becoming a competitor in the software space because Nvidia is building their own AI tools and platforms. OpenAI is no longer just a customer. They're becoming a hardware designer through their partnership with Broadcom and TSMC. They're actively seeking to commoditize the very chips that Nvidia sells by proving you don't need Nvidia-specific hardware to run AI models efficiently. Both companies are making moves that directly threaten the other's business model while publicly insisting everything is fine. The reality is they're still married by necessity. OpenAI's entire current infrastructure fleet runs on Nvidia GPUs. They can't just flip a switch and move everything to Cerebras or AMD or their own custom chips overnight. That would take years and billions of dollars in investment. So they're stuck with Nvidia, whether they like it or not, at least for the near term. But the Nvidia divorce narrative is important because it highlights that the era of OpenAI being exclusively beholden to Nvidia is ending, and that has massive implications for the entire AI industry. If OpenAI can successfully reduce their dependence on Nvidia, that opens the door for every other AI company to do the same. It breaks Nvidia's stranglehold on the AI hardware market. Nvidia has been printing money because they had basically a monopoly on AI chips. Every AI company needed their GPUs to train and run models. That gave Nvidia incredible pricing power. They could charge premium prices because there were no real alternatives. But if OpenAI proves that custom chips or alternative suppliers like Cerebras can work just as well or better for inference, suddenly Nvidia's moat isn't as deep as everyone thought. From Nvidia's perspective, this has to be terrifying. Their entire stock valuation is based on the assumption that they're indispensable to the AI revolution. If the biggest AI company in the world is publicly diversifying away from Nvidia and signing huge deals with competitors, that challenges the fundamental thesis behind Nvidia's market cap. That's why the stock drops 10% on these rumors. But from OpenAI's perspective, they have no choice but to diversify. Their burn rate is absolutely insane. Reports suggest they're spending billions per year just on compute costs. If they stay completely dependent on Nvidia, they're at Nvidia's mercy for price. Nvidia could raise prices, and OpenAI would have to pay whatever they demand because there's no alternative. That's an untenable business position. So OpenAI is doing what any rational company would do. They're creating alternatives and negotiating leverage. By developing custom chips and partnering with Cerebras and AMD, they're telling Nvidia, we have options now, so you better give us competitive pricing or we'll take our business elsewhere. That's just smart negotiating strategy. The problem is they had to do all of this publicly because of the scale of the deals involved. A $10 billion partnership with Cerebras isn't something you can keep quiet. Custom chip development with Broadcom and TSMC gets reported in industry publications. So what should have been private business strategy became a public spectacle that tanked Nvidia's stock and created this whole divorce narrative. Jensen Huang's comments about OpenAI's business discipline are particularly interesting in this context. He's basically saying OpenAI is spending money recklessly, and Nvidia doesn't want to commit $100 billion to a company that might not be around in 5 years. That's a legitimate concern. OpenAI's revenue doesn't come close to covering their costs right now. They're surviving on investor funding. If that funding dries up, or if they can't figure out a path to profitability, they could collapse spectacularly. And Nvidia doesn't want to be left holding the bag on a $100 billion commitment to a company that goes bankrupt. So Huang saying, we'll consider each round at a time, is actually Nvidia protecting themselves from OpenAI's business risk. But OpenAI probably sees that as Nvidia not having faith in them, which creates tension. OpenAI thinks they're building the future of AI, and Nvidia should be grateful to supply them with chips. Nvidia thinks OpenAI is burning money unsustainably, entirely, and they should be more careful about who they commit resources to. Both perspectives have merit, which is why this relationship has gotten so complicated. The other factor here is that Nvidia is hedging their bets by investing in OpenAI's competitors. They've put money into Anthropic, which makes Claude. They're working with other AI companies. So from OpenAI's perspective, Nvidia is literally funding their competition while also being their main supplier. That creates obvious conflicts of interest and trust issues. Why would OpenAI share their proprietary chip requirements and infrastructure needs with Nvidia if Nvidia is then going to turn around and potentially share that knowledge with Anthropic or other competitors? That's a real concern. And it's another reason why OpenAI needs to diversify away from Nvidia beyond just cost considerations. So there you have it. OpenAI tried to reduce their dependence on Nvidia by signing $10 billion deals with competitors and developing custom chips, which created a market panic and forced both companies into damage control mode. The relationship went from partnership to complicated rivalry in just a few months. If you think OpenAI is justified in diversifying, or if you believe they're making a huge strategic mistake, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments which company you think has more leverage in this relationship going forward.